Education is in a state of flux. It's operated on a traditional industrialized business model for well over 100 years. And yet, education is not a business. And we can no longer continue to operate it as such if we want our children to experience the same types of freedoms, comforts, and securities to which we've become accustomed to. You see, when education began in the United States, it was not designed to teach all children to high levels. It was designed for a small handful of thinkers and a large mass of doers. Children were sorted and selected. It goes back to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, said that he wanted children to be able to get an education to do two things, primarily transact their business, as well as to participate in their civic community. And so he proposed the idea that we offer our children 3 years of schooling gratis or free to teach the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And at the end of that period, a visitor to town was to choose the boy of the most genius to move on to further schooling in more complex subjects. And from that point, a student then was to be chosen again, and in Jefferson's words, raked from the rubbish to move on to further schooling. We continued with this method of sorting and choosing for many years until the turn of the Industrial Revolution, when factories began to take over the farms as a primary place of work, and rural Americans began to flee the farm for the factory. And what they found when they got there, while expecting further freedoms and securities and opportunities, they found a world that was very regimented and one that was highly controlled. And it was a world that turned human beings made of flesh and blood into machines. Put on a door, turn a screw. Put on a door, turn a screw. Put on a door, turn a screw. We were not designed that way. And yet, it wasn't just the adults that were working in the factories, it was children as well. And the adults, they were incensed. Children cannot work in the factories. They're taking our jobs. And so a deal was struck. When these factory owners said that they couldn't afford to lose child labor, they said, but we'll create a better worker for you, a more compliant worker, if we will educate them in rows and teach them to follow directions and move them by a bell system similar to that of the factory. You see, factories didn't happen because of schools. Schools happened because of the factories. And that continued for many years in our country. And as business began to blossom and as money began to be made, the economy began to grow, and we needed a new kind of worker, a white-collar worker. And the white-collar worker, even though they might be pushing a pencil or hammering away on a keyboard or calling on customers, they were still really a factory worker because their work was measured, it was planned, it was highly routinized. My dad worked in a factory in a white collar. He was in sales and very successful. But he would drive to a place fighting Houston traffic and stop at a place of business and say, what kind of paper products do you need? What size? Do you need paper towel? Do you need toilet paper? What about chemicals? Any cleaning supplies? And he would take their order and write it down and pack it away and drive to the next place of business. And he would walk in and meet with the office manager and say, what paper products do you need? What sizes? Do you need paper towel, toilet paper? Do you need chemicals, cleaning supplies? My dad was very successful at that, and yet it was very routinized. But in that time, the middle class became a product of the factory system because it offered this. It offered a chance for job security. It offered a chance for benefits, insurance, retirement benefits. You were promised the American dream. And it worked for a while. But the world is changing amongst us. But as business continued to boom, we began to experience something brand new in our country, abundance. And we began to make a lot of money, and business was bringing in lots of money. We became a consumer-driven society where we consumed. And then material success became the signpost of material possessions were the signpost of success. And madmen began to tell us what we were missing in our lives. Or as Brad Pitt said in Fight Club, advertisers have us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate, to buy stuff we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't really like. And as economics grew in our country, so did disparity. And in 1965, in his War on Poverty, LBJ signed into law the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the most far-reaching federal legislation for education of its time. And it began to bring about this concept of standards and of measurements and accountability, and with it came lots of red tape and bureaucracy. And these types of reforms continued well along the way. After the publication of A Nation at Risk, we saw the passage of Goals 2000, and then what I consider the most aggressive education policy our country has seen, No Child Left Behind, that required 100% of our students to demonstrate proficiency regardless of their age, regardless of their culture, regardless of if they even learned a language or if they were disabled, and even in cases where a child was on his deathbed, was still to be assessed and meet those standards. And with those waves came increasing pressure and more business ideals. We saw more business ideas such as, let's just pay teachers for their performance, and that will make it better. But Daniel Pink would say, if then rewards are only good for simple routinized tasks, tasks such as that requires creativity and such as teaching, is very hard to incentivize because teachers did not get into the business to make money. So it's really impossible to measure a teacher's worth in terms of pay. What Pink would say is we need to actually raise the base pay of teachers. And to that I add, we must give our teachers the respect that they have earned. We need to hold them in the high esteem as we do our doctors and lawyers and such. That would be what would make a difference for us. But as we continue to see, these reform measures continue on again, as with the recent passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which continues to emphasize standardized assessment. Why? At a recent conference in Austin, Sir Ken Robinson spoke, and he shared that last year, the NFL was a $9 billion industry. Last year, Hollywood was an $11 billion industry. Standardized assessment was a $16 billion industry between the publication and the materials to study for the exams. That sounds like business to me. And to that I say, education is none of your business. Do we really want standardized kids? Or do we want to inspire them? Do we want to celebrate diversity? Do we want to look at creativity and encourage them to be what they were created to be? You see, each of these reforms is merely just putting lipstick on the pig. And we know that weighing the pig over and over and over won't make it fatter. And yet we continue down this path. Dr. Jeffrey Turner, retired superintendent, said we can no longer operate a 19th century system using a 20th century accountability model and expect our kids to gain 21st century skills. We've got to begin to consider doing things differently, and here's why. Technology has been a game changer. Technology is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. And it has changed our world. Think of this. When people go to file their taxes, most don't go to an accountant, they go online. And when it's time to order a new pair of shoes, they go online and have an endless amount of choices, and they can order the color that they want and the size that they want, and it's delivered the next day at the door without ever having left the house. You see, the white-collar jobs that were to protect the middle class are going away. And our world is changing as a result of that fact. It was said that knowledge doubled at the turn of the century. In about 1900, knowledge doubled every century, every 100 years. By the end of World War II, it's thought that knowledge was doubling every 25 years. Today, knowledge doubles every 2 years, and we're not far from it doubling every year. And that brings about a whole new challenge in our world. You see, our schools aren't failing. We're failing our schools. We continue to operate on this outdated model, like teaching children in rows and teaching content in isolation. That concept of the courses we take over a 12-year period where classes are taught in isolation, I go to math, I go to reading, etc., was decided back in 1892 with a so-called Committee of 10 who made those decisions. Yet we know that children learn at different speeds, but we still group them by age. You know, some children could learn algebra in 2 weeks. Let's just say it took me a little longer than that. But the student that it takes 2 weeks to master, we have them go for 2 whole semesters. We've been doing this model a really long time. Also, we have a system of carrots and sticks, students chasing A's and GPAs, and it's about individualization. Whereas creativity and creation, which is what Tony Wagner of the Harvard Lab of Innovation would say, today's problems are too complex to solve on our own. We need to move away from this consumption idea to a model of creation and innovation. And yet we continue to put the carrot and stick model in front of our kids and expect them to continue to follow, which is merely a factory model way of thinking. Our country is very failure adverse. You see, in consumerism, failure is fatal, but in learning, it's essential. One of my most hated phrases is failure is not an option when it's applied to education. Well, I say this, if failure is not an option, then neither is success. We've got to look at failure differently. Perhaps, as the Stanford Institute of Design says, F is the new A. And some businesses are beginning to adopt the mindset that fail early, fail often is essential in the process. Perhaps we could think of failure as an acrostic. Fail is the first attempt in learning. If you've never failed, you've never tried anything new. It's an essential part of our growth. You know, back before the factory, when we were still on the farm, children contributed to the family economy. They were essential to the survival of the family. They picked crops, they took care of animals, they took vegetables to market to sell, they repaired equipment. They contributed to the family. Yet, as Jennifer Senior writes in her book, All Joy and No Fun, today, children are economically worthless, but emotionally priceless. You see, their contributions today have been really merely reduced to turning in homework and maybe a few chores. Alan November, EdTech Guru, says we need to go back to the farm idea, but look at it this way, what he calls the digital learning farm, where children should be content creators, not consumers. They should be creating things such as tutorials. When they're working on a concept, making a video explaining how to do that and posting it to the web for others to share. We should be connecting to other schools, to other districts, to other states, or even other countries, and allowing our kids to collaborate, because that is the world that awaits our children. He says that they can also take on social concerns and social projects that they can use the internet to reach out and solve many of these problems. You see, we've got to think in new ways. Whether it's blended learning, a combination of learning online and having a traditional teacher, or whether it's flipped instruction, which would require a student to watch a video online of the teacher teaching and then come to class to get help with the homework. Because I know this, my kids would have benefited greatly from that model, because once they started adding letters in with the numbers in math, I was like totally out. Having worked with campuses of poverty my entire career, I even envision our impoverished communities having the school become the hub of the community, where partner with mental health services, medical health services, dental services, childcare, recreation, library, and that it's open beyond the traditional hours and traditional days, that it truly becomes the center of the community. We've got to think and challenge and use our opportunity to come up with new ideas. Winston Churchill said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." Well, it's our turn to begin to try new things. The last phrase of the national anthem says that we will conquer, we must, when our cause is just. And it is our children who we must stand up and speak our voice, that our founding fathers afforded us the right. They were trailblazers. They rejected the status quo. They were creators. They went about things very differently. And so we've got to take that opportunity that we've been afforded as students, as parents, as educators, as politicians, as Americans, to have our voice be heard. Diane Ravitch says, one of our architects, by the way, of No Child Left Behind, who's since come out and apologized for its creation. She's come out and said, parents are the sleeping giant. Parents have made a difference. We've seen parents band together, reduce the number of assessments from 15 standardized assessments to 5. In our high schools, we've seen some band together and completely opt out. We've got to use our right as Americans. Is these ideas scary? Yeah. Because we all know how school works. But I don't think it's any scarier than how the farmers must have felt when we left the field for the factories. And as we come to a close tonight, as we talk through big ideas, disruptive ideas, I'll leave you with this thought. Don't think of how it is, but of how it could be.